Carve a few Chinese lattice windows to frame the harmony between heaven and humankind.
Build a long corridor of the East to reach the innermost depths of history and culture.
It is a meandering melody of Suzhou music, sung with grace and elegance.
It is some simple sketches of mountains and forests, not wanting in detail and delicacy.
Pick 1,000 pieces of lakeside rock in all shapes and contours.
Take a share of the Suzhou waters with all the mist and haze.
Paint scrolls of floral light and watery shadow.
Write a few chapters about the fading years and distant times. The relationship between the literati and the gardens has always been a matter of great interest. Some scholars were the original owners of these gardens. Some participated in the designing and building of these gardens. Others loved gardens, knew the gardens really well, and wrote about them with passion.
This last category of scholars are especially interesting. They never owned any of these gardens, nor did they participate in their designing and building. But because they were longtime residents of Suzhou, or simply ordinary members of the Suzhou citizenry, they developed a special bonding with the Suzhou gardens in sorrow and joy, in life and death.
Located in the affluent lower Yangtze Valley, Suzhou is a place where scholars abound. Without going too far back into history, we can just look at the Ming and Qing dynasties and find numerous literary talents and dilettantes leaving their marks here. Among these were famed masters like Wen Zhengming and unsuccessful scholars like Shen Sanbai. They dedicated their thoughts and emotions to the landscape south of the Yangtze, sang of the scenic beauty of Suzhou, and recorded their tender feelings about its gardens in minute details. One might say that the scholars' eulogies about the gardens are as numerous as the plants in these gardens.
Among these scholars and their works, one deserves special mention, and that is the Qing Dynasty scholar Shan Fu styled Sanbai and his 6 chapters of a floating life. The book is an autobiographical work in prose that includes depictions of art in everyday life and the portraiture of a real-life character in the author's wife, Yun. The couple never accomplished much, but they were able to transcend the pressures of the mundane world and face their tribulations with equilibrium. They believed that simple clothing and plain food can keep one happy all one's life. They considered this the most beautiful lifestyle in the world.
Actually, there are plenty of cases of couples living a life of affection and poverty. What makes 6 chapters of a floating life especially popular is the prominence it gives to the pivotal role of culture in an ordinary family. This is also true of many families in Suzhou. Their life is simple but harmonious, enriched by their cultural taste and their affinity with the beautiful gardens of Suzhou. The pavilion of surging waves was right in Shen's neighborhood. Its water surface was where the happy couple enjoyed their time together on a boat.
6 chapters of a floating life is a very thin book. Its author was a poor scholar, almost penniless. Lin Yutang translated it into English, and the translation sold quite well abroad. He wanted to visit some of the sites, so he came to Suzhou in the 30s, bringing his camera with him. I was going to school in Suzhou at the time, and was asked to go with him to see two places. One was the tomb site of Shen Sanbai and his wife Yun on Gangfu Mountain. The other was their living quarters. There was a third place, one that's mentioned more than once in the book, that is, the Narcissus Nunnery. So, altogether, 3 places. We spent 2 days on Gangfu Mountain, but found nothing. We didn't find Shen's residence either, nor did we find the nunnery. I told Lin Yutang that he was crazy. Shen was neither rich nor powerful. If he were, he might have luck finding the site of his residence. Then, how could he afford to build a big tomb? It must have been just a mound. It was just not there anymore after 200 years.
This is how the pavilion of surging waves is depicted in 6 chapters of A Floating Life. By the side of the eaves there was an old tree which spread its green shade over the window and made the people's faces look green with it. And across the creek you could see people passing to and fro. We passed a bridge, entered a gate, turned eastward and followed a zigzag path into the place, where we saw huge grottos and abundant green trees. The pavilion stood on the top of a hill. Going up by the steps to the top, one could look around for miles, where in the distance chimney smoke arose from the cottages against the background of clouds and rainbow hues. After a while, the moon had already risen from behind the forest, and the breeze was playing about our sleeves, while the moon's image sparkled in the rippling water. That is the joy a Suzhou garden can bring to a true citizen of Suzhou.
The literati in the traditional sense of the word includes some of the best artists, as well as scholars and poets. The unique relationship between the literati and the gardens has, therefore, not only produced numerous anecdotes about writers and gardens, but also generated memorable stories about artists and their relations with gardens.
Suzhou gardens provide the excellent environment for dwelling. They are also the ideal locations for poetic composition and artistic creation. They are the favorite resorts for artists of all times. The Listen to the Maple Garden, where the present-day Suzhou Academy of Traditional Painting is located, is a typical studio garden. Listen to the Maple Garden was the residence of Wu Yun, governor of Suzhou Prefecture during the Qing dynasty. He was a famous connoisseur of seal engraving, calligraphy, and painting. Therefore, the garden was a meeting place for famous calligraphers and painters. Wu Yun hired an instructor for the children of the Wu family. It was no other than the budding young artist Wu Changshou, then in his 30s, but later to become the doyen of a whole generation of artists.
I should say that painters have quite a close relationship with the gardens. Historically, painters participated in the designing and building of many gardens. Wen Zhenming was involved in the building of the humble administrator's garden, as was Nizan in the Lion Grove Garden. This is also true of the more recently built gardens. When Gu Zishan built the Garden of Happiness, many painters participated in the designing. Painters need a good environment. The garden is a vehicle of Chinese culture. It provides the environment for playing the zither and chess, as well as for calligraphy and painting. The Academy of Traditional Painting also has a close relationship with Suzhou's gardens. When it was founded in the 1960s, it was located in the Garden of Happiness. It was first called the Traditional Painting Studio. Later, it was moved to the Pointing at Cypress Lounge in the Lion Grove Garden. We then relocated ourselves in the humble administrator's garden and stayed for a time in the Tower of Distant Fragrance in Prince Zhong's mansion. So it is quite appropriate to say that our academy has a very close relationship with Suzhou's gardens. We moved to the Listen to the Maple Garden in 1985. This garden was built towards the end of the Qing dynasty, sometime during the reign of Emperor Guangxu. The owner's name was Wu Yun styled Wu Pingzai. When you mention Wu Yun, you have to mention Wu Changshuo. The two men were about 33 years apart in age. Wu Changshuo had just begun to learn seal engraving. Wu Yun showed him lots of books and manuals on the subject and gave him advice. So, in a sense, Wu Yun was Wu Changshuo's teacher in that respect.
If Wu Changshuo had not yet made his name as a painter when he lived in the Listen to the Maple Garden, Zhang Daqian was already a famous master when he lived in the Master of Fishing Nets garden. Zhang moved into the garden in the early 1930s. A native of Sichuan, he became famous in the lower Yangtze Valley, the birthplace of the Suzhou style of painting. If Wu Changshuo had not yet made his name as a painter when he lived in the Listen to the Maple Garden, after establishing himself as a painter in Shanghai, he wanted to avoid all the social events there, so he picked the Master of Fishing Nets garden as the site of his creative work. This exquisite garden, known throughout the lower Yangtze Valley, was the ideal environment for an artist to cultivate himself.
This is what Zhang Daqian wrote about the garden. The garden, the library, the studio, all blended in one. Plain, simple, elegant. A beautiful landscape is created with architecture, rockery, pond, and plants. It changes its face all the time, borrows cleverly from distant scenery, and is full of twists and turns. You roll up the curtain, and what you see outside the window is blue sky and white clouds, light on the mountain and shadows of trees. Like a miniature scroll painting, like a casual drawing, through every lattice window what you see is a remarkable painting. There are people in these paintings. The paintings frame the people. I wish this would last till eternity. I'd like to probe its depth, but can't.
Living with Zhang Daqian in the same garden was his brother, Zhang Shanzi. His specialty was painting tigers. He kept a tiger cub in the garden. The Zhang brothers called it Huer, tigerling. The cub in this commercial poster from the 1930s is an image of the tigerling.
Later, when Zhang Daqian was living overseas, he was nostalgic about the garden and the deceased tigerling. So he wrote the inscription, "Tomb of Tigerling kept by my deceased brother Shanzi," on a piece of paper and sent it through different hands until it finally reached Suzhou. In 1986, the Suzhou authorities in charge of gardens had it engraved on a stone tablet and mounted it on the white wall west of the Late Spring Chamber in the Master of Fishing Nets garden. In this way, a long-faded historical episode involving gardens and painters became a concrete scenic attraction.
As private property, the rise and fall of a Suzhou garden is inseparable from the circumstances of the owner's family. At the time it was first built, the owner would invest all his energy and resources into its design and construction. But as the Chinese saying goes, wealth doesn't last beyond 3 generations. Some gardens lost their glory once the owner passed away. If the descendants were unworthy, the garden would be sold and change hands in the blink of an eye. Such instances were not infrequent in the history of gardens. The humble administrator's garden changed hands because one of the owner's descendants had lost in gambling. Many of the gardens, after the families went broke, fell into decay. And in the course of time, what was left was only the ruins of walls and wells, the remains of ponds and rockeries.
Actually, the thriving and decline of gardens were more closely linked with the thriving and decline of the entire region, and the thriving and decline of the region is inseparable from the fate of the nation. During World War II, when the nation's mountains and waters were violated, the secluded courtyards fell into ruins, and the undulating white walls became ashes. The misty waters of Suzhou turned into this ancient city's sad tears and dripped into the Suzhou Garden's heartbreaking history.
After the war ended, I came to Suzhou again. I loved gardens, so I went to visit the lingering garden again. But the garden was a shambles. It was laid to waste. Nothing was left, just an empty shell. What is now the garden's most beautiful building, the five-peaked celestial house, was used by the enemy as a stable. The horse dung piled up deeper than a person's height. Even after the dung was removed, it still smelled dung several feet into the ground. The house was just not there anymore. Only the empty frame. The pillars were badly damaged by the horses gnawing.
By the time Suzhou was liberated, only a small number of gardens in Suzhou, such as the Lion Grove Garden, were still relatively well maintained. Most were in bad shape. After the founding of the People's Republic during the early days of construction boom, the government pooled the resources to launch projects of investigation and protection of the Suzhou gardens. In 1952, the city government established its Garden Management Office. In 1953, restoration of the gardens began on a large scale. Again, with the change of fate of the nation, the centuries-old Suzhou gardens were revived.
The first to be restored was the lingering garden. I was then the director of the restoration committee. I was from Guizhou, so I wasn't familiar with the local conditions. I couldn't pretend that I knew everything, so I invited Mr. Zhou Shouzhuan, Mr. Fan Yangchao, and others to work with me. There was a place called Lotus Flower Mound, where they sold used doors, windows, partitions, pillars, floor planks, etc. The price was very low. I remember we needed 10 panels for a screen in the Forest Spring House for the elderly. How much did they cost? 10 yuan. Nowadays, you can't get this kind of stuff even for 10,000 yuan. The calligraphy and painting scrolls that were hung there are all gone now. Those were the works of famous artists from the Qing dynasty, the pre-Republican era, like Wu Changshuo. I contributed my collection of Wu Changshuo, so we can say the lingering garden was richly endowed. With the experience of the lingering garden, we restored most of the gardens which are open today in 6 to 7 years.
To this day, Suzhou's old-timers cannot forget the euphoria of the garden restoration projects, nor can they forget the joy that the completion of these projects brought. In those days, the gardens were not so crowded. Its peacefulness and tranquility were a perfect match with the lifestyle of a city whose land borders on waters and whose streets parallel its canals. Indeed, it wasn't until then that these famous gardens of the lower Yangtze Valley finally bade farewell to the miserable days when ghosts wail at the autumn graveyards. The elegance of urban gardens was finally unveiled. Deep down the alleys, the layers of dust collected from historical turmoil were finally washed clean, and a freshness emerged like bright flowers beyond willow's shade.
At the turn of the new millennium, a group of scholars familiar with the history of Suzhou edited a photo album titled Old Suzhou. It recaptures the images of the city over the past 100 years in a total of over 300 carefully selected historical photos. Naturally, these include many old pictures of Suzhou's gardens. Some of these record the beauty of deserted landscape in some of the famous gardens. Others show some of the little-known small private gardens, which were actually the courtyards of ordinary citizens. The proximity of this latter type of garden to the everyday life of old Suzhou makes people feel all the more nostalgic.
These gardens, located in the back of the alleys, used to be private and are still inaccessible to tourists today. But residents of the neighborhood, old and young, can go there and have fun. In that sense, these are extended versions of private gardens now turned public parks. I think this gives people a wonderful feeling. People of my age were born in the 50s. At that time, we were too young and didn't think it was a big deal. As a child, I was under the impression there wasn't an alley in Suzhou that didn't have a garden like this, as if we couldn't live without gardens. When it came time to review our lessons, we would go to a classmate's home that had a courtyard with some banana trees and lake stone rocks in it. We would sit down on one of the drum-shaped stone stools and do our homework. As I recall now, it was really a beautiful setting. So we can say Suzhou people unconsciously blended the gardens into their daily life, into their very existence.
We cannot talk about these petite neighborhood gardens without mentioning the remaining speck garden in the vicinity of the North Temple Pagoda. This garden was first built during the reign of Qing Emperor Guangxu. Later it became the property of famous painter Wu Daiqiu and is now occupied by Wu's oldest son, painter Wu Yamu. According to Mr. Wu Yamu's recollection, his father originally planned to buy the mountain villa of circular grace. But despite its beautiful landscape, the mountain villa has only one corridor and 2 halls, with no living space. So he finally chose this place.
The remaining speck garden was partly lost to the neighborhood for residential housing. But its main body, the garden proper, still maintains its original grace, thanks to the meticulous care given by this family of painters. By the end of the Qing dynasty, there were over 300 private home gardens, most of which were small, exquisite gardens blended into the life of ordinary people. Their existence provided the cultural foundation for Suzhou's identity as a city of gardens. One has to say it is the good fortune of Suzhou that these gardens have been preserved to this day.
This is another small-scale courtyard garden. It's called Little Violet Villa. Its owner was Zhou Shoujuan. Zhou was born in Shanghai in 1895, but his ancestral origin was Suzhou. He was a writer of urban popular fiction of the early 20th century, identified as a member of the literary movement known at the time as the Mandarin Ducks and Butterfly School. Zhou loved plants and spent all his savings on the construction of this courtyard house. It was named after the literary magazine Violet, which he once edited.
After liberation, Zhou wrote a great deal of prose essays of an informal and elegant style and made great contributions to the urban development of Suzhou. As an old-style man of letters, he was honorably treated. Chairman Mao Zedong himself had private conversations with him.
Besides being a writer, Zhou created penjing and was a penjing artist of renown. Penjing is the artistic manipulation of plants, whereby the natural landscape of mountains and forests is miniaturized into an artistic indoor display. The popularity of penjing is closely related to the thriving of gardens in Suzhou. During the Cultural Revolution, garden art was condemned and consequently suffered severe damages. It was only to be expected that Zhou's Little Violet Villa didn't escape the scourge.
当时我们这个院子有24个国家的外国朋友来参观过。那么，
At that time, our courtyard garden had already received guests from 24 countries. Our national leaders, from Premier Zhou Enlai on down, including Marshal Ye Jianying, Li Xiannian, Cheng Yi, and so on, also had visited this place. This morning, I came across an essay my father wrote, which described the visit by the Panchen Lama and his family. All this means that the door of our house was always open to everyone, whether it was a national leader, penjing lovers, ordinary working people, or artists and writers. We had a visitor's book made of rice paper. Every single visitor, no matter who, was welcome to leave his or her signature. I remember during the Cultural Revolution, The Red Guards made my father set fire to a whole stack of visitors' signatures in front of the Lotus Lovers' Hall. My father was very sad. He wept as he watched the papers burn. At that time, when the storm came, when he was singled out for condemnation by the central and local authorities, my father felt quite certain that his case was hopeless. On the evening of August 12, 1968, without leaving us a single word, my father suddenly took his own life by jumping into this well in the middle of his own courtyard. He had always used the water from this well for his flowers. He must have felt that if he had to die, it would have to be in his own garden, to perish with this little violet villa. I was only 12 years old. My father's death was like a bolt from the blue. But I think both my mother and myself as his daughter will try our best to preserve this little violet villa, because it is the courtyard garden which my father devoted all his life to cultivate. We won't let it be destroyed by human folly.
From today's point of view, all these stories about the gardens of yesterday may have lost their color or turned yellow, like these precious old photos.
What is it that made these old photos increasingly attractive over the years? Is it time? The grains of age?
More vivid than the photos are the historical films from the archives. To the people of Suzhou today, these shots of old Suzhou in the 1920s and 30s may look both strange and familiar, both close and distant. What is it that makes all this old film footage so valuable? Is it again time? The months and years gone by?
Suzhou's gardens, like its old town temples and ancient streets, have gone through all the wind and rain of time and witnessed tremendous historical changes. One might add, though, that while sharing the same fate of this ancient city, the hillocks and ponds of the gardens, their flowers and trees, their windows and entrances, their corridors and pillars, have embodied the glories and decays, the trials and tribulations that are unique to the gardens, and the gardens only.
If we weave together all the episodes of the garden's history, what we see are the chapters of bygone days and years carved into the earth of the lower Yangtze Valley.